Richard Kravchak, and I play the oboe. The oboe is a fabulous instrument that I hope I can help some of you to do well with. One of the great things about the oboe is we get to have the most beautiful melodies in the band, and there aren't that many of us. And the oboe is a wonderful scholarship instrument. What do I mean by that? Most universities need several good oboe players. And even if you decide not to major in music, you can often pay for your college education by being a good oboe player. And today, I'm going to talk about some fundamentals that will help you in your journey to be the best oboe player that you can be. The most important thing when we play the oboe is to have good breath support. Now, you've probably heard your band director and others say to support with your diaphragm, and you're probably not quite sure what that means. Well, I want to see if I can help you to understand. So we should blow into the oboe with our abdominal muscles. Those are your stomach muscles. And so when we breathe in, we should relax our abdominal muscles. It feels like sticking your stomach out, almost like a bellows. And it looks kind of funny. So I'm going to turn sideways. And don't worry, you won't be chubby like me if you do this. In fact, this will help you to be slim. So when I breathe in, my stomach comes out. When I blow, I push in and up with my abdominal muscles. And what's important, I'm going to put my oboe down for a second here to show you something. What's really important is when I blow out, that my chest not sink. So I'm going to put one hand on my upper chest, one hand on my abdominal muscles. So I breathe in, I blow out. And I keep my chest expanding. Now, when you first start to breathe like this, it may feel a little strange, or it may feel like you're not even getting a full breath, but that's okay, because that is the best way to play on the oboe. Now, here's a really good exercise that my students use in order to find their proper blowing muscles. So what I'm going to pick up my oboe now, and then what I ask my students to do is exhale all of their air so they feel like they have zero air in their lungs. Without any air at all, I want them to play a low G as loud and long as they can. So that looks and sounds like this. You won't be able to play it that long. If you can play it for a long time, you haven't exhaled all of your air. So what that feels like is your stomach is really tight. So what we want to do then is when we take a proper breath with our abdominal muscles, we want to reproduce that feeling. So now I'm going to take a proper breath. So that is how to support the tone on the oboe. The second fundamental that we need to learn on the oboe is the embouchure. Now that's kind of a funny French word, and that is just the word for how we hold our lips, our mouth, and our teeth when we play the oboe. So I tell my students we need to play the oboe with an open mouth. Now, of course, we need to seal up our mouth when we play, otherwise that would just be silly. But we need to totally relax our jaw. You drop your jaw down just like you've gone to the dentist and you've gotten a shot of Novocaine. And then you're going to make your lips as if you're going to whistle, and then you turn them in. And then the other thing I tell my students is we put the reed on our lip. We don't bury the reed in our lip. If we bury the reed in our lip, then the notes won't come out very well. So the correct embouchure in the oboe looks like this. Another thing that will show you if your embouchure is correct is you want to check to make sure you don't have jaw tension. A lot of my students have jaw tension. So we should be able to move our jaw side to side while we're playing the oboe. Now, of course, you wouldn't really do that when you're playing in band, but this is just something that's good to check every once in a while in your practice sessions to make sure your jaw is relaxed. So let me show you what that is. Even when I'm playing the high register. Sounds a little funny, but the sound keeps coming out. If you find that the sound drops out when you do that, that means your jaw is probably too tense and you're supporting the tone with your jaw rather than with your wind. Okay? Another thing that young oboists struggle with is how much reed to put in their mouth. So when we're in the middle range, which I would say is from low F to fifth line F, so low F, to fifth line F. When we're in that part of the oboe, the reed should be in our mouth just so the interval B to C sounds good as in tune. So let me show you what happens, first of all, if I put too much reed in my mouth. Now I'll play a B to C. Oh, excuse me, I have a little plumbing issue. That happens on the oboe, so I'm going to blow the water out. Okay, so I'll do that again, B to C. Some of you have probably heard oboe players that sound like that, okay? So if you listen carefully, the C was too sharp, and it was too bright compared to the B. Now, if I don't have enough reed in my mouth, and this is usually not a problem, but sometimes it is with some oboe players, the C will be too flat in relation to the B. So can you hear that C? It sounds like it's a stomach ache, doesn't it? Okay, so now if I have the right amount of reed in my mouth, both notes sound good, and they sound in tune, and one doesn't sound brighter than the other. The other important thing about the oboe embouchure, and this is very different than if you play a single reed instrument. I bet some of you started out on the saxophone or the clarinet before you went to the oboe. Well, on the saxophone and clarinet, our embouchure should stay still when we play. If we're playing a high note or a low note, it should be the same, but that's not the way the oboe works. So the higher we play on the oboe, the more reed we need in our mouth. And of course, the lower we play, the less reed we need in our mouth. And let me show you what that's like. So I'm going to play some of my B flats. That's a pretty high one, isn't it? Some of you probably aren't playing that B flat yet. So did you see how I got a little bit more reed in my mouth every time? Now let me show you what would happen if I tried to play my low B flat in double high B flat position. That doesn't sound very good. So if you find that your low notes are really hunky like that and you're not getting all the way down to the fundamental tone, probably means you have too much reed in your mouth. And if your high notes are flabby and flat, I bet some of you have heard oboe players that sound like that, huh? Rather than a nice B flat. Not enough reed? The right amount of reed. And then with the really super high notes, if you don't have enough reed in your mouth, it won't come out at all. Probably a lot of you are already playing the high D. A lot of young oboe players have trouble getting that high D to come out. That's because they don't have enough reed in their mouth. So that is how to form your embouchure for the oboe. Another important fundamental for the oboe is articulation. That is how we separate or connect the notes. Now, a lot of us know that sometimes we use our tongue to start the notes, and sometimes we just connect them without separating them with our tongue. Now, what's important about articulation on the oboe, and this is also different from the flute or the clarinet or the saxophone, is that we always use the same syllable, tu, like T-U. Sometimes if your band director wants a really legato passage, they may ask you to use the D syllable. Well, that doesn't work very well on the oboe. And let me demonstrate something about that, and you can try this at home too. So if you put your hand right in front of your face and just whisper the syllable tu, you'll feel a puff of air. Now whisper the syllable do. You'll hardly feel any air at all. The oboe, because the oboe reed is so tiny, needs that little extra puff of air. So it's always important that we use the syllable tu when we are articulating. Now sometimes you'll hear people say ta or ti. The problem with ta and ti is we use more of our tongue. And so then we get an explosive sound, and that doesn't sound very good. So if you want to sound really good on the oboe, always use the syllable tu, almost like it's in your nose, tu, like you're pretending you're from France, tu, tu, tu. Another thing that you sometimes hear people say is, try using a breath attack. And I have a confession to make. As a professional oboist, sometimes I use a breath attack. But those are really difficult to control, and I don't recommend that any of my junior high or high school students use breath attacks. I recommend that for college students and above. So in the meantime, in order to have good, accurate, dependable articulations, use the syllable to. Another important thing to address in order to play the oboe well is hand position. How do we hold our hands on the oboe? It's important that we play the oboe with curved fingers. So here's a really good exercise, or not an exercise, but a demonstration to show why it's important to use curved fingers to play the oboe. So what I want everybody to try at home is put your hands in your lap, pretend you're at your computer keyboard, and you're just typing randomly as fast as you can with curved fingers. Okay, now I want you to flatten out your hand and do the same thing. See how much harder that is? That's why we always want to use curved fingers on the oboe. Now sometimes people will press so hard that they recurve their fingers. That's a really bad idea, because then your finger is just locked in place. A couple other things about hand position that are important. So the left thumb on the oboe has only two places that it's allowed to go, either on the body of the instrument or on the thumb octave key. Some oboe players play with what I call an expressive thumb. So if they're playing the note D or something, they'll, and their thumb does a little dance like that. Well, the problem is then what if they need to use the octave key? They're way out of position, and that doesn't work very well. So only on the body of the instrument or on the octave key. Now, your right thumb supports the weight of the instrument. So it's important that the thumb rests go right about where the nail and the flesh meet. Now, I'd like to talk about fingerings on the oboe. Unlike some instruments like the saxophone, for example, where there's most notes except for maybe B flat only have one fingering that you can use. But the oboe has a lot of fingering choices. So first of all, make sure that you have a good and accurate fingering chart. Now, along with this video, Dr. Dalton is going to post the notes for the video, and there'll be a link to one of my favorite fingering charts, and it's free on the internet, and it's awesome. It's got trill fingerings and actually fingers for all the woodwinds, so I really highly recommend this. But I want to talk about a couple of fingering problems that I hear all the time. So the C sharp in the middle register of the oboe is one of the most beautiful notes if you play it correctly. Doesn't that sound nice? Now, there's an alternate fingering on most fingering charts called open C sharp. Do you like the way that sounds? I don't. Now, that is okay if you're trilling. So if I want to do a nice trill, C to C sharp, that sounds pretty good. But don't ever, even in a technical passage, don't ever use that, because it just doesn't sound that good. And sort of along those lines, there's what we call the trill D. Now the C on the oboe in the middle register, of course, is fingered 1 and 1, and then we have to get a lot of fingers down and go what we call over the break to get to D. So that would be an awfully hard trill to do. So there's a nice trill key on the oboe. So it sounds really good when you do that, but if you play that trill D as a real note, as opposed to, so don't ever use that trill D as a note on the oboe. That's only for trills. So another real issue on the oboe is what we call the forked F. Now, one of the oboes that I play is the Baroque oboe, which is the oboe from the time of George Washington. And that oboe doesn't have an F key on it, so you have to finger F, 1, 2, 3, 1, 3. Now, sometimes we've held on to that fingering as an alternate fingering. So we should only use forked F before or after any note where we have to put this finger down, your ring finger in your right hand. Otherwise, we have to slide here, and that doesn't work very well. Now, some oboes, like I'm very lucky, I have a beautiful oboe, and my oboe has a left hand F right here. So I can use that instead of forked F sometimes. But I would say the general rule on forked F is only use it if you really have to, because it also doesn't have quite as nice of a tone quality as the regular F. Another thing about forked F, if you are playing on a beginner model oboe, like for example the Selmer model 1492, which used to be the Bundy oboe, and that's a very good oboe, by the way, for beginners, and that's another video that we'll do sometime about equipment. We're not going to talk about that today. But that oboe does not have a F resonance key, which is this key right here, which just works automatically. So when I play forked F, it's open. So it vents it and makes it sound a little bit better. If you don't have that key, you have to add the E flat key. However, what happens sometimes is people learn on one of those oboes with no F resonance key, and then they go to a intermediate or professional oboe, and they keep using that key. And if you do that, it's too sharp. Let me show you. So here is my regular F. Here's my forked F. Here's my forked F if I add the E flat key. See how sharp that is? And the tone quality is not very good. So we want to make sure that we avoid that. Another finger that we have to deal with is the left hand E flat. And that's kind of a hard key to get to. It's over here, and we play it with our left pinky. So why do we use the left hand E flat? If I'm playing from D flat to E flat, or if I'm playing low C to E flat, because we never want to slide here, because that is a really hard motion to do accurately. Now, one of the things you have to be careful about on left hand E flat is sometimes for young students, when you use this finger, it pushes this finger over and it uncovers that hole right there, and so they get a squeak. And they're wondering, why does my oboe squeak when I play left hand E flat, but it doesn't squeak when I play regular E flat? That's why, because you're pushing your finger over. So you have to be very careful about that. So another fingering that we sometimes have to use is the right hand A flat. Some of you don't even know what that key is, because we don't use it that often. And that A flat is used when the note before the A flat or after the A flat involves any of these keys, because it's hard to, again, to slide and jump like that. So, make sure you get good at finding that, because it's a little bit hard to find. And I would say, though, the most common finger mistakes are made with the octave vents. Now the oboe, my oboe has 3 octave vents. Now there are some oboes that have 4 octave vents even. Some professional oboes have we call it a high octave or 3rd octave key. I don't really like those, so I like mine the way it is. But the 3 octave vents are the half hole, the thumb, and the side. So we use half hole only on C sharp, D, and E flat. Now those notes will come out if you add the thumb octave key also, but it makes them too sharp, so don't do that. Starting on E natural, we cover the half hole and we use the thumb octave key. And that's all the way up to A flat. Starting on high A, we use the side octave key. Now this is where it gets a little strange on the oboe. In the United States, we play on what's called the semi-automatic octave key mechanism. What that means is the side octave key overrides the thumb octave key. So let's say I'm playing from G to A. I don't have to let go of the thumb octave key because the side octave key will override that. So we use the side octave key, A, B flat, B, and C. Now here's a part where a lot of young oboe players get it wrong. Starting on high C sharp, so for high C sharp, high D, and high E flat, we don't use, well on high C sharp we use no octave key at all. High D, we use a half hole. High E flat, half hole. Don't add the thumb octave key, because if you add the thumb octave key, sometimes those notes won't even come out. And if they do, they'll be weird and sharp and yucky. Now, starting on high E, this is the place in the oboe where we actually combine octave keys. So we never combine octave keys on the oboe until we get to high E. And on high E, so all the way up to the high A, we use the thumb octave key and the half hole. And above that, it just gets weird. There it is, my double high C. And that is what I have to say about fingerings on the oboe. One of the most important things on the oboe is to have a good reed. It's more important, I think, than any of the other reed instruments, except maybe for the bassoon. If we don't have a good reed, we just can't function. If you play the clarinet or you play the saxophone, don't tell your friends that play clarinet and saxophone this. You could kind of function with a suboptimal reed. It may not be great, but you could. But if you don't have a good reed on the oboe, it doesn't work at all. I really, really, really recommend that you find a source for handmade oboe reeds. And these days on the internet, there are lots of sources. So just try reeds from several different makers and see which ones work best for you. And as far as strength goes, medium soft or medium is the right strength for most players. Don't get a hard reed thinking you'll get a better tone. That just gives you a harsh tone and makes it hard to get the low notes out. And the other important thing about reeds is to take good care of them. Now, when you buy your reeds, they'll come in a plastic tube. Those tubes are not intended to store your reeds. Those are just for shipping. If you store your reeds in those tubes, number one, they'll never properly dry out and they get all moldy and you'll get a science project in there. Yuck. And the other thing is the tips of the reeds are very, very thin. They're thinner than a piece of paper, actually, if the reed is correctly made. And those tips will just break. So I have this lovely reed case, which you don't have to have a fancy reed case like this, but you should have a reed case. I know that Rico makes a plastic reed case, which is lovely. I think it holds 8 reeds, and it costs about $10. And that's, your reeds are expensive. And so that's really worth it. And it will help you to make the reeds last as long as possible.